Welcome to our first webinar in the 2022 season as we observe the 6th Annual National Day of Racial Healing. Today's webinar is entitled Exploring the Connection Between Racial Healing and Health. County Health Rankings and Roadmaps is a program of the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. This webinar is co-produced with Healthy Places by Design and is the result of the contributions of many colleagues and partners in Wisconsin and across the nation, including the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I also want to acknowledge that the views of speakers outside of CHRNR are their own. So hello, my name is Erica Burrows-Girardi. I am the Senior Outreach Specialist at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, and today I'm joined by colleagues who are going to share in your learning experience. I also want to mention that my background is a little bit different. If you guys have been following along with our webinars, you'll recognize this is a different background. That's because instead of being in Florida in my home, I'm actually in Wisconsin with my colleagues. And so the first person I want to introduce you to today is Joanne Lee, who actually is in North Carolina. But Joanne is with Healthy Places by Design. And I also want to mention that yesterday was her birthday. So join me in welcoming Joanne and wishing her a happy belated birthday. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Erica. Thanks so much for the introduction and the birthday wishes. Appreciate it. And hi, everyone to the out there in the audience. As Erica mentioned, I am with a partner organization to CHRNR called Healthy Places by Design, and we provide a variety of supportive services to county health rankings and roadmaps. My role today in this webinar will be to manage the Q&A box. So the Q&A is one way that you can engage with us during the webinar. As you listen to our presenters today, you don't have to wait to submit a question as it comes to mind. Use the Q&A, type in your question, and I'll be monitoring it so that when we get to the Q&A portion of today's webinar, we can try to field as many of your questions as possible. I'll also be facilitating the post-webinar discussion group, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. But for now, I want to hand it over to Tommy Jaime, our colleague with CHRNR, and he's going to tell you how you can engage with us in the chat box. Hi, Tommy.
Hey, Joanne, thanks, and happy birthday. I can see that you're already getting a lot of birthday love in the chat box. And so hi to everyone out there. I'm excited to be here with you all, and I'll be chatting with you in that chat box today. And just a reminder that when you're chatting, please make sure that you use the drop-down box and choose chat to everyone before you send your message. That way everyone can see the chat. And if you have a question, please be sure to place it in the Q&A box where Joanne will meet you, like she said. And next up, I'd like to introduce James Lloyd. James is a colleague here at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, and he'll be helping with technology today. If you have any tech issues during the webinar, please let us know in the chat. Hey, James.
Hi, Tommy. Thank you so much. And as Tommy mentioned, I'm happy to do what I can to help facilitate the technology that we're using today. In addition, I just wanted to point out that we are captioning our webinar today. So if you are looking for closed captions, look in the toolbar of the Zoom meeting, and hopefully that will help. With that, Erica, I think I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, James. And I want to let you know that we are going to be live tweeting during this webinar, and you're welcome to join us in that live tweeting. Simply go to CH Rankings and Twitter and at Twitter and kind of retweet what's being tweeted right now. And when you're in Twitter, you're going to meet another one of our colleagues that you often don't see. Her name is Colleen Wick, but Colleen is our communications associate. So she's busy right now over there in Twitter. So some of you might be new to County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, and I like to call us the CHRNR family. So give me a moment to introduce you to our goal. CHRNR is committed to growing community power to improve health equity, and we actually ask that you join us in this effort. And we're known for sharing data to help you do that. This data can help you identify who isn't thriving in your county. We also point to evidence to share what research is showing works to improve health equity. We share guidance to help you take steps to action. And lastly, we offer stories to give you real life inspirational examples of what equitable action looks like. CHR&R is comprehensive, and that our goal is to provide you tools and resources to move you from data to action so that in the end, everyone has an opportunity to thrive, no matter their zip code, color of their skin, age, or any other aspect that makes us unique. Check out the chat right now, because Tommy is chatting a link to how you can learn more about what we do at CHR&R and why we are so happy to be able to help you in the work that we do. Now, as I mentioned earlier, today is a meaningful day. It is the National Day of Racial Healing. And one of the events that serves as a backdrop for this day will forever be etched on my brain. On June 17th in 2015, the world was rocked when 9 innocent parishioners, including an elected state official in South Carolina, were murdered at Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. And they were engaging in Bible study, and they were murdered simply because they were Black. I'll never forget that event. I'll never forget where I was. Perhaps some of you are like me and distinctly remember hearing about it in the news. I'm a graduate of the College of Charleston, which is just a block away from this church. And when I was enrolled in school there, I spent time at Mother Emanuel Church, as we affectionately called it. And as a result, the tragic event really hit close to home for me. I've graduated years ago from the College of Charleston. In fact, this year actually be 30 years since I've graduated. And I no longer live in Charleston, but that traumatic event, because I have a relationship with this community and this city that I love so much, that traumatic event will forever be something that's etched in my mind. So today, on this National Day of Racial Healing, we revisit this tragedy not to sit in the trauma of it all, but to recognize it as a catalyst for Charleston's journey of racial healing. Because racial healing, or some may call it reconciliation, is a major building block in the creation of an equitable community. Now, there's a role for both government and community to play in a racial healing journey. And today we're very fortunate because we have two people who are going to tell us both sides, both what the government can do and what communities can do. So we're fortunate to have Amber Johnson and Crystal Robinson Rouse with us today. And Amber is the Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation Manager with the City of Charleston. And Amber will be discussing municipal government's role in a racial healing process. So Amber, if you wouldn't mind just come on camera and just say hello to everyone.
Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much, Amber. And we're going to touch base with her in just a second. And right now, I want to introduce you to Crystal Robinson Rouse, who is the Director of Collection Action Networks for a nonprofit called Tri-County Cradle to Career Collaborative. That is really hard to say, Cradle to Career Collaborative, but I know she calls it TCC, and that's what I'm gonna do. So Crystal is also the chair of the Youth and Education Subcommittee for the Special Commission for Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation. And today, Crystal's gonna be sharing the role of community in racial healing. So Crystal, if you'll just come off camera and say hello.
Yes, good afternoon. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And I encourage you to read more about our guest bios on the webinar's resource page. Tommy's already chatted that out to you, but you can just go there and check out their bios, which are absolutely wonderful bios. So before we bring our guests back, I just want to take some time to do some level setting before we dig deeper, just so that we're all clear about some of the terms that we're going to hear and we kind of understand what the role and what racial healing is and what role that plays in health. So I want to start by saying that before we can even engage in racial healing, we must first understand what racism is and the damage it creates. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, racism is a system of norms, practices, policies, and structures that assigns values and determines opportunity based on the way people look or the color of their skin. Racism can show up in multiple ways. It could be interpersonal or structural. But either way, it prevents those affected by it from attaining their highest level of health. Lynn was committed to naming all root causes of equity, and racism is one of those root causes. And it leads to unfair outcomes between racial and ethnic groups. And we contend that these inequities have persisted for far too long. Last year, we did a webinar on declaring racism as a public health crisis. And some of the feedback that we received from you all from that webinar is that you wanted to dig in deeper to topics like this because you are wanting to build your capacity for how to deal with racism and its effect on health. And so a number of government jurisdictions are agreeing with CDC and making these declarations, and that number is growing. So why is that important? Well, declaring racism as a public health crisis or an emergency positions governments and communities to take action in a number of ways. They can leverage data to prompt multi-sector collaborations to focus on addressing the root causes of health disparities. These declarations can include action steps with government accountability because meaningful impact in addressing racism as a public health crisis requires change and capacity building within a government. And also, these declarations position governments at the city, county, and state levels to embed anti-racism practices within their policies and systems. CHR&R, in partnership with Healthy Places by Design, has created a resource for you if you're considering making such a declaration in your community. So I encourage you to check out these inspirational examples on our website. You'll learn how the impact of George Floyd's death, coupled with the impact of the pandemic, prompted the city of Minneapolis to reflect on the trauma that their residents were experiencing and start a healing process. You'll see how Milwaukee County chose not to ignore decades of data, reflecting a historic trend of people of color in that county suffering from years of unjust policies that were giving rise to inequities. Now, Milwaukee County is engaged in building a culture of equity among county departments and partners. And then we also have a state example. After its state legislature unanimously passed a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis, Nevada's governor set up a system of accountability to assure that resources would be allocated to achieve the action steps in the resolution. So these examples show that city, county, and state governments can take meaningful action after being intentional about racism's role in health. You'll receive a link to this resource in the webinar resource guide that we're going to email you tomorrow. Now let's make sure that we have a shared understanding of that term, racial healing, racial reconciliation, that you're going to kind of hear used interchangeably throughout the webinar. And I want to talk about why that's important to health. So racial healing brings people together to take collective action for a more just and equitable world. It recognizes the need to acknowledge and tell the truth about past wrongs created by individual and systemic racism and address the present consequences. It can facilitate trust and build authentic relationships that bridge divides created by real and perceived differences. And this last part, I think, is the most important. Racial healing is essential prior to making change in a community. Any change that's going to promote health equity must include this racial healing process. It's an essential part. Like I was saying before, it's a major building block if we're looking to create an equitable community. And this type of work, this racial healing, it's not a one and done. it's a journey. You simply don't check a box in which your organization or your community, let's say, let's host an event and then say, well, that's done. We're all healed now. There are several national organizations, including ours, that's ready to support you in this work. And Joanne has provided links to the resources that you see here and more resources, even more resources that's going to be included on your resource guide tomorrow. But if you're looking to start a racial healing process, do your homework first. And this is how you get started. And remember, I was telling you about the role of government in this work. Well, Living Cities is an organization that's committed to helping local governments walk through a racial healing journey. They even created a curriculum called the Reckoning with Race curriculum that guides municipal governments in a racial healing process. And here on the screen, you see the topics that are included in that curriculum. Now, one of the local governments that actually is an alum of this curriculum and this work is the city of Charleston, South Carolina. And with that, I want to invite Amber back to the mic. And Amber, again, thank you so much for coming today to share your story, to share what's happening in Charleston. And I know that following the tragic mass shooting that following the tragic mass shooting, what transpired, I'm sorry, and I don't know why I can't get my words out, but what transpired in the city of Charleston is that you ended up becoming its first equity, inclusion, racial conciliation manager. How did that happen? Tell us how that happened.
It's definitely been a process for the city. Following the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, our police department created a year-long project called the Illumination Project. The goal of that project was to illuminate or shine light on the issues in our community and building better relationships with our police and our community. Through that process, they were able to hold several listening sessions. They were able to talk to over 800 residents and come up with a strategic plan on how they could build better community through our police department. And following that project, they were also able to do a racial bias audit of the department. I think that it's important to note that most police departments, when they do a racial bias audit, it's something that they're ordered to do. Our police department volunteered to enter into this process. So now they're in the implementation stage of trying to implement the recommendations that came out of that audit. Shortly after our racial bias audit, our city passed a resolution formally apologizing for its role in slavery. Part of that apology included the creation of my office, and then I was brought on a year later to start this work with the city. So it's been a journey for us that we're still on.
Yeah. And what are your primary responsibilities in your role?
Currently, my primary responsibilities are to develop an organizational strategy to make sure that we can advance racial equity within the city, internally and with our community. Internally, we have a racial equity core team, which is a team of staff members from across departments. Each department is represented on that team. Following a train-the-trainer model, we're hoping that every member of that team is able to take back the information they learned to their department and to specifically embed racial equity into the work that they do every day. We've also had our special commission on equity, inclusion, and racial conciliation. It was my role to help manage that process. So it's been a process for us, both internally and externally, to make sure that our city is advancing racial equity.
Yeah, I love the fact that you said all your departments within the city of Charleston are working on this together. So it's that internal work is just as important as the external work. And there are key partners that are involved in this process in the external work. So who are the city's key partners in the racial healing process?
The key partners for our work has been our local college that you're very familiar with, the College of Charleston. I've been working with their Master of Public Administration program. They have a community assistance program. So they've lent me some hands to help me with the work, helping me in developing a racial equity framework toolkit to work with our racial equity team. And they've also been assisting me with our train the trainer sessions that we've been having with our staff members. I've also been working with Living Cities, as you mentioned earlier. They're Closing the Gap Network, which has provided me with peer support and also the resources to continue this work within the organization. Throughout our process of creating our special commission on equity, inclusion, and racial conciliation, we were able to become a member of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So we've been able to use their tools and resources in the work that we do. The National League of Cities has also supported us in their work. We've been a member of their racial tension cohort, and currently we're working with their Equitable Economic Mobility Initiative grant, and they're providing us with technical assistance to do that work. And then our Special Commission on Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation, we had several community members on that commission, and then those community members represent our community organizations. So they've been able to connect the city to those organizations and the work that they're doing locally.
Yeah, I love the fact, Amber, that we see as key partners, you've got national, you've got local, you've got organizations that support municipal governments, and then you have community organizations that are part of this work. So, you know, you're showing, this is just a great example of how a racial healing process has to be diverse. And it's just not one group who can do this. It's just not one sector, but it's everyone. And with that, I want to ask you about this special commission, like what has been the first key step in the process? Was it developing that commission?
The key step for us has been the commission. Shortly after George Floyd, the city realized and acknowledged that there's something that needed to be done and it needed to involve community. So we passed a resolution giving a commission 90 days to come up with a set of recommendations to help for our mayor and our council to help them figure out what the path would be moving forward to advance racial equity within the city. Our commission consisted of 6 council members, 7 community members, and then those 7 community members led 7 different subcommittees. And then those subcommittees, they met weekly, and then they developed their recommendations that we were able to compile into one report that we were able to present to council for approval.
90 days.
90 days.
But that's okay, because you're actually showing that this is truly a journey, and you actually have some good news that you're going to share with us later on in the webinar. But I'm looking at the different committees that are on the special commission, and I want to draw the audience's attention to the different committees that are listed here, because you can see that these committees actually align with health factors. Housing, mobility, transportation, those are health factors. Education and income, those are health factors. Criminal justice, which here we at CHR fold into community safety, is a health factor. History and culture, we kind of fold that into family and social support here at CHR. That's a health factor. So the point that I want to make is that racial healing, racial conciliation, this work is actually about health. And in order for you to move the needle on health, you have to have a process in which you are addressing these issues that are so much affect our health outcomes. And Amber, you know, racial equity work isn't easy, and racial equity champions such as yourself often experience bumps in the road. Can you share what challenges you've experienced since starting this work?
I think, as you mentioned, 90 days is a challenge. to come up with intentional recommendations to really move this work forward. So when we started our work, that was the main thing that we heard from our community members, is that we needed more time. Our 90 days turned into close to a year, but it was a challenge for us to get beyond that because we had that limitation. So it kept coming up, and it was definitely an issue for our group. We all know that talking about race is a difficult thing to do. Doing it privately is hard, but our requirement to have all of our meetings in public made it difficult, especially having elected officials on the commission. They just found it difficult to have these types of conversations. I think some of the language and the words that we chose to use in the report, it became challenging for people with limited understanding of what they mean and the foundation of those words and why they were so important for us. And so I think those were most of the challenges that we encountered, is that it's hard to get everybody on the same page and at the same level of understanding about how to move the work forward.
Yeah, level setting is so important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I spent just a tad bit of time at the beginning of the webinar, but it is hard to move folks forward when there's not a clear understanding of where you are and where you need to go and how do we get here. So another reason why we recommend that if you're thinking about a racial healing process in your community, check out the resources that we have available for you and the resources that have been able to support the city of Charleston, because it's a process, but it's also something that you don't want to go into without having a little bit of capacity, building your capacity to be able to address it. Unfortunately, like you were saying, Amber, so much of it is political. So no doubt there's probably people in our audience who are struggling, especially if you're a racial equity ally. But Amber, for those of us needing some encouragement, like share what gives you courage to continue this fight.
I find courage in knowing that my family is here. I am a Black woman who's from the city of Charleston, and it's just important for me that I have an impact and I'm part of the change that occurs in the city, not only for my family, but for my future family that's coming behind me, and just making sure that I'm a part of the change that I want to see for them going forward.
Yeah. And I love this quote that you put in here by Bell Hooks. And when you sent me your slides, she was still with us. But since then, unfortunately, she has passed away, but those words still hold so much meaning. So thank you so much for kind of getting this conversation started. I am going to circle back to you for you to share a little bit of good news that's coming out of the work that you have been so committed to. So, but I'll circle back to you in a second. But at this point, I want to ask Crystal to come back. Crystal, thank you so much for joining us today to kind of continue the story. We've been talking about what the role of municipal governments are, and I know you're here to share what communities can do. Mm-hmm. But I want to start by telling you, I took a look at your impressive bio, and one could argue that your entire career has been equity focused. So why was it so important for you to serve on this special commission when you were invited? I mean, it's not like you're not busy. You're a very busy person. And you're also in school, I understand, working on your PhD. So why was it important for you to take the time to serve on the special commission?
Thank you for that question, Erica. One of the things that I stick true to is a quote in words from Ella Baker: "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it happens." When it comes to racial equity is a step towards freedom and liberation. As a mother, as a youth and parent advocate by nature, a community organizer and educator, I love connecting the dots and keeping folks connected around different entities that we all may need. When it comes to this work, the reason why I found it important to serve on the commission is to continue that work that I had set out and signed up for many, many moons ago as an undergraduate student. Anyone who knows me understands my passion for youth and children and families and communities when it comes to equity and anti-racism work. As I may have mentioned before, Ella Baker, I learned of her from my work with the Children's Defense Fund, whose mission is to ensure every child a healthy start, a head start, a fair start, and a safe start, and a moral start in life. During my time with Freedom Schools, that's where my passion for this work around equity and dismantling racism pretty much flourished and grew, especially because that was in those moments is where I learned about the many inequities that face people in our area, people who are Black and brown, who look like me and others who are on this panel and viewing. And as we talk about racial equity, I mentioned a healthy start. And to ensure a healthy start, we have to seriously focus on mental health and trauma faced by Black and brown families and communities, not only here in Charleston, but all across the country.
Mm-hmm. And as we've seen in the webinar thus far, local government can help lead a racial healing process. But you as a member of the community, what can you bring to this effort, and how can community members leverage their power to contribute to a racial healing process?
And I am so thankful for this question because oftentimes we forget about the value of community members who are as valuable, if not even more valuable than elected officials, right? Because we are the individuals who elect them into office. We should definitely stand firm on what we believe, stand firm in our power as tax-paying citizens to help drive the decisions that are made on our behalf by those who we elect to represent us. Without community action and participation, it's hard to ensure that the work that is being done, especially around race and equity, is done with intentionality and not done in a performative manner, because performative work is not long lasting. And when it comes to racial equity work, it requires all hands on deck. Me as a Black woman, it's important for me to support and help with the facilitation around healing of people of color, and also to help all of us navigate through internalized racist oppression, right? And some of the work done or that needs to be done or should be done by those who are in positions of power, usually identified as white women or white men, would be to listen and learn, support communities of color, not be afraid to allow Black and brown faces to lead in this work around racial equity, and to understand the difference between anti-racism, equity, and equality, because they are not all the same. Racial equity work, as we know, it's you have to be in it for the long haul. It is not easy work, and it requires that those of us who are in it together, and also understand the reality that we didn't get here overnight. It took us centuries to get to this, this point as it pertains to racism. So unraveling racial equity is not anything that's going to happen overnight. It's not an overnight fix.
Right, right. And even 90 days seems like a short time to start something, to even to make those recommendations. But there were 3 verbs that when I first talked to you that came up when I asked you about this work, and I asked you, what can communities do? And you said, ask questions for clarification. Tell me what you meant by that.
Okay, so with asking questions, what I was communicating is that we oftentimes receive information given to us by elected officials or those who are at decision-making tables. However, we don't go beyond the information we receive to ask questions. Once we receive information shared by those who are decision makers, we should question it, ask questions, dig a little deeper. I often encourage people all the time, if you hear of a community conversation, whether it's something you're fully interested in or not, go ahead and participate in that, because you'll be surprised at some of the connections that you'll make in that space. And then with that, with this work, definitely finding your tribe, connecting with those who are in it for the long haul, are not afraid to stand up for what they believe in, engaging in conversation and interactions. Just those different pieces, I think, is what's very important, because oftentimes we get fed information that may not be fully accurate for our particular constituents. But we go with it because that's what's most popular and what's most verbalized and vocalized.
And I know you also talk about the fact that communities' viewpoints and their lived experience matter. And sometimes people don't realize how much that matters. Tell me, why is that so important to a racial healing process?
It's important to the racial healing process because if we don't get to the root or touch on the root or understand exactly where we are impacted most, we will never come to a resolve. I think a lot of times when it comes to talking about racial healing, we forget that racism not only impacts African Americans or people of color or those who are, Black and brown, but also those who are considered white. And I say that because racism impacts all of us to the fullest. And Amber, I know Amber has also experienced this. We participated in a training with that was held through our YWCA, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that a lot of our participants, which was a mixed group, learned was how racism and racial inequities, if we were to even the playing field, those who have the most were to, share out with resources or help or information with those who do not have that access, how no one will lose. We will all win.
Right.
And I think once we all come to that realization that by equalizing the playing field and understanding that with racial equity, everyone will win. No one loses. You won't lose out on anything that your privilege allows. So I think that's important.
Yeah, that zero-sum narrative that is pervasive is really not true. Yeah, when we are able to lift up those who are struggling or simply trying to survive, let alone thrive, we all win in that situation. And then you had that third verb that was so important, which was hold. Hold your elected officials accountable. And people need to remember that, your vote speaks volumes. So reminding people about how important it is to be involved in the political process. So I want to ask you, I'm going to take the audience back to this slide because you are, just to remind folks, the chair of the Youth and Equity Subcommittee of part of this commission. Again, you do this as a volunteer. You are, you do have a full-time job. You're a full-time student as well, but you're also are volunteering your time to chair the Youth and Education Committee. And I'm so glad that that subcommittee is part of the special commission, because education is one of those factors that do have an influence on our health outcomes. But given your role as the chair, what is the subcommittee saying needs to shift in education for racial healing to occur?
Okay, and before we move forward, I also want to share that I am a full-time mom and wife. I can't leave that part out.
That's right.
Because that, of course, feeds into my passion of the work. So as far as our commission, we named a lot of pieces and aspects. Our group actually started out with a logic model to actually plan out exactly where are our resources, what are our short-term, long-term goals and aspirations and hopes, so that we can try to do everything that we could to connect the dots. And of course, within that work, one of the main things that we saw and lifted up was mental health and trauma-informed care. Because as I mentioned before, a child who comes to school without food or proper sleep, that impacts their health, which inevitably will impact their overall success in education. So that was one of the things that we had definitely lifted up in our group. Also, family and community engagement, which is something that is always on the table, because oftentimes educational spaces, community spaces, government spaces, we often look at family and community engagement as outward communication versus an actual true interaction, and understanding that what we may have learned within our educational upbringing may not be the end all mean all for every community and every child that we're serving. Another piece that we talked about was definitely looking at the curriculum, which we really, as commissioned under the city or working with the city, it was a harder area to play around, because of course curriculum is within the schools and the school districts and or the charter schools in the area. But one of the things that we did discuss when talking about curriculum is how to help enhance and support it, even if it's not within the classroom during the 8 to 3 time frame, definitely through after school programming or community groups or community organizations, where we can enhance it so that a lot of what my children and other children who may look like me and my children, what they experience and learn is relatable to them, because a lot of our textbooks, a lot of our tests, a lot of the assessments that our children have to, take to pass, or, so on and so forth, do not relate to them. Yes, we may change a name here and there and a math, for example, a math word problem, but that does not mean that it is culturally relevant to that child. So just naming those few pieces within our subgroup were huge. And just trying to figure out how to best connect the dots between schools, government, community, youth, family, because it's very disconnected. And we could do a lot better with that, just even within our own local area and space.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you for being a tireless advocate for this work. And I want to ask you a question that I asked Amber. It's kind of similar to what I asked Amber, like, what gives you hope as you continue to fight for equity?
Okay, so like Amber, it's good to be back home. I moved back home in 2016, so I was able to experience growing up in Charleston until the age of 18, going off and then coming back. So being home, reconnecting with individuals and families and groups who are doing the work, getting to know those who may not be doing the work but need to be connected in with the work. Another thing that actually gives me hope is how COVID-19, although it negatively impacted our communities, it exacerbated the many issues, especially around health and especially around racism throughout the country. It really caused people to take action towards dismantling racism, as well as dismantling the systems that support racism, such as education, housing, economics, health, so on and so forth. And then last but not least, definitely the passing of the most recent reading of the commission gave me a lot of hope. There's a lot of us who have done this work tirelessly inside and outside of the commission. So we're looking forward to the work that the city will be doing moving forward, as well as other community groups and organizations that we represent and work with as well. So that gives me a lot of hope. Oh, and one more thing before I forget.
Well, okay.
Sorry, Erica. We do one thing that was actually established in conjunction with the Kellogg Foundation are actually racial healing circles. We actually started hosting those this past fall through the entity that I work with. The Citadel has been doing it for a while, but actually holding those racial healing circles gives me hope as well.
Oh, that's awesome. And speaking of the passing, I wanted to bring Amber back on screen. So if you'll join us now, Amber, to kind of share that good news that Crystal hinted at. tell us what's happened with your racial conciliation work with the city council meeting that just happened like last week.
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, the commission was only supposed to last for 90 days. And through our work with our community members, we realized that this work has to continue. So our goal has been, since we presented our final report, is to create a standing commission that will stand permanently. And so we have had 2 readings of an ordinance already for a permanent commission. We have to have 1 more reading that will occur next week. So we're really hopeful that our council will pass this ordinance, and we'll have a commission that's continually working on this work so that we can move forward.
That's such good news. And one of the things that I remember when you gave me that good news, because I knew that it was going to be on the city council meeting docket. So I reached out to you the next day and I asked you, I said, Amber, why do you think it passed? And do you remember what your response was?
Absolutely. It was our community support. They really showed up and they really told city council that this is something that they wanted. They made sure that their voices were heard. And throughout this entire process, it's been our community support and their willingness to say what they need and speak truth to power, and also just to amplify my voice as a person sitting in a position by myself. I think it's been really just helpful to help us with moving this work.
Yeah, and so, the point that I want to make is that we need Ambers in the world, but we also need Crystals in the world. And so with that, I want to thank you both. I want to hang tight because we've got some questions that we want to ask. But I want to thank you so much for sharing how your work in your respective places marry together to make successful outcomes. And again, this is a journey, folks. This is not a one and done. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but you all are heading in the right direction. And I love the fact that we've been able to share your story with our audience. And so now I want to hear from you, our audience, because we're curious if you feel like you could adapt the strategies shared today within your community. And those strategies include a racism declaration, local government leadership in a racial healing process, as well as community involvement in a racial healing process. So James is going to launch a poll, and I'm going to ask you to simply respond yes or no. And then in the chat, if you don't mind, tell us what challenges you think you might encounter if you were to implement some of these strategies. Now, this is an anonymous poll. We're not sharing the answers or anything like that. We're just curious about whether or not you feel like this is doable. And then just go ahead and let Tommy know in the chat what challenges you think you might encounter. And we're doing this because we actually want to hear from you in the community about what it is that you encounter when you do this work. And now I'm going to ask Joanna, let us know what's been happening in the Q&A box. What questions are people asking? And James, you can go ahead and stop sharing the poll.
What's been happening in the Q&A box? This has been very, very busy. So thank you so much to Amber and Crystal, because, with these webinars, we not only want to give folks a good start on what strategies might be successful and actually grounded in community, but we want them to also think about some complex issues such as racial healing, and you both set the stage for that. So there's probably going to be more questions than we can address. Erica, I've encouraged a bunch of folks to join us in the post-webinar discussion group, because some of the issues that have bubbled up really need some time for discussion, hearing from not only our presenters, but others in community. So hope you all will join us. But let's get started with the questions I have queued up. So Amber, when you mentioned the inventory that the city went through, people's ears just perked up as that being a tool that could be really, really helpful for their organizations or their cities. And so folks wanted to know if it's possible for them to access that inventory. And if you could just give a brief highlight or some examples of what from that inventory you're most hoping to implement in Charleston.
And when we say inventory, we're talking about the recommendations from the
the racial bias inventory or the audit?
Okay, so that audit was done by a third party for our police department. And the results of that audit are located on, I think, the city's website. So I think it can be found there. So I can share it with you all to share with people later on.
Great. Yeah, and we did include a link, folks, to the website where there's all of the information about the commission is on there. That'll be in your resource guide. Okay, the second question, and I don't know if Amber and Krista, you want to tag team on this, but folks were really interested in how the members of the commission were selected.
So for us, it was really important to find people who were subject matter experts in those 7 different areas, but people who also understood racial equity and what it would take to make changes in that specific area. So we had people reach out to us, to the commission members, our co-chairs, and to the mayor directly. We also had an application process where people are allowed to apply. And then we also reached into our networks of people that we knew locally who were doing this work already, and asked them to join us.
And just to add on to that question, one of the things that I appreciated about the commission was them working with those identified and selected as commission chairs to ensure that their particular subcommittee included everyone who needed to be at the table, right? So for example, for the Youth and Education Subcommittee, although we didn't have any youth or students apply, for me, it's very important to have a young person at the table. And Amber agreed, and it was brought before the mayor and everyone else. So we did have a young person who is now a freshman at Tennessee State University, very excited for her, that did excellent work, brought awesome insight into a lot of what we discussed within our subcommittee.
That's great. A great example. So Crystal, I'm going to stay with you because Rashonda, her ears perked up when you mentioned racial healing circles. And so she wanted to know how does one join a circle, or how can one get one started in their community?
Okay, so what we did, we actually, there are a number of different community individuals who are part of our actual cohort, which is actually through the Sophia Institute here in Charleston. But what we did was we went through an intensive training with the Kellogg Foundation on exactly how to do the circles. I want to say we spent, I know it was more than 3 or 4 days of full day training, understanding exactly the intentionality behind the racial healing circles, what the outcomes should be, how we should move forward, how we should organize the racial healing circles, and what it should be inclusive of. And of course, racial healing circles are going to look different in different settings, only because it should be connected to and conducive to the group that is within the healing circle, right? So what I would suggest, and I can drop the information in the chat, I wasn't prepared with information here, to actually contact, I guess, our contact person in our area who facilitated, to connect you with who we worked with the Kellogg Foundation.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Crystal. Erica, how many more questions can I pitch?
Go ahead and ask another question.
Okay. Well, this one's going back to Amber, or maybe Crystal, you can chime in, but folks were really thought it was great that you forged a partnership with the police, and wanted to know, in reality, what were the challenges that you might have faced, particularly if there was a police union, and how did you balance the mistrust that people might have in, around policing in the city?
So for us, our police department has been doing a lot of work. So our criminal justice committee was also staffed with a staff member from the police department, a staff member who's intimately connected with the racial bias audit and the recommendations from that audit. So we were able to connect our recommendations to that racial bias audit. And then we also have a citizen advisory panel that's connected to our police department, and our chair from the Criminal Justice Committee is also a member of that committee. So we're all having the same conversations and working towards the same goal. So we've been able to connect the conversations, and that's how we've been able to move the work. So it's still challenging and it's been difficult for us, especially with like implementation of the recommendations from the racial bias audit, but it's something that's constantly a part of the conversation. And we know that it's work that's not going to go away because our community really pushed our police department and our city council to complete that audit. So they want to see the results implemented. So it's work that continues and it's still challenging. I can't say that everything was resolved from a racial bias audit, but it definitely started the conversation and showed us the areas and where the gaps are for us to do the work.
I think
Great.
that's so important that
Excellent.
you said it started the conversation, because so oftentimes the conversation just doesn't even start.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, I think I will kick it back to you, Erica, knowing
Yeah.
we're almost at the top of the hour.
We are, for that exciting discussion that we will have. But thank you so much, Joanne. In fact, Joanne is probably getting ready to head over to the discussion group right now. And I would love for you to share your thoughts on today's webinar. Tommy's chatting out a link to a brief evaluation. And it would be terrific if you can click on the link and when you see it in chat and complete the evaluation after the webinar, because we so much appreciate everything that you say, and we value your feedback. Again, that's one of the reasons why we decided to dig into this topic again. So we definitely would like to hear from you. And next month's webinar promises to be just as exciting as today's webinar. And so I'm going to ask that you join us for a candid conversation about what shifts we need to make if we are really serious about building equity. Dr. Georges Benjamin with the American Public Health Association will open our discussion, and then we're going to hear from a panel of public health leaders, including Natasha Walsh with the National Association of Counties, and Ankit Sanghavi with the Texas Health Institute. So you do not want to miss this discussion, and you can register today at countyhealthrankings.org/webinars. So make sure you do that. And as we wrap up today's webinar, I want to tell you about a discussion group that was going to allow us to just kind of further explore the topics that we've been talking to Amber and Crystal about. And these conversations give you a chance to be face-to-face with other webinar attendees and share what you're doing locally, as well as ask questions. So Amber and Crystal will be there. Joanne's going to facilitate the group, and Tommy's chatting out a link to the discussion group now. So if you are able, please join us for that discussion group. It's going to be fun and engaging. I know it, because this is just such a great topic. Before we close out today's webinar, I want to thank Hafizah Omar for contributing to this month's webinar content. Hafizah is with Living Cities, and for more information about Living Cities, please check out livingcities.org. And then also make sure you follow us on social media, and we are now on LinkedIn, which is so exciting. So be sure to follow us on LinkedIn as well, but also make sure you sign up for our newsletter. This is the best way to find out about our exciting webinars and our latest tools and resources. And County Health Rankings and Roadmaps is preparing for the 2022 rankings, and we have some exciting news that we'll be sharing with you in the near future as well. So you're definitely going to want to subscribe to our newsletter so you can be the first one in the know. So thanks to Amber and Crystal for sharing their wisdom with us today, and I appreciate all of you for observing the 6th annual National Day of Racial Healing with us. So please hop on over to that discussion group, and I will meet you there. And thanks to all of my colleagues for their support in this webinar. And I will see you all next month. Have a good afternoon.